Today, I'm going for a walk in Thomas Lake Park. Thomas Lake Park is a city park in Eagan, Minnesota, along the shore of Thomas Lake. The inspiration for this walk comes from the City of Eagan's History on Deck playing cards. Each card highlights a person, place, or event in the history of the city. The card that caught my attention was a 7 of diamonds. It claims that an oil well was once in this park. I thought that Minnesota did not have any fossil fuels. Could the story on this playing card be correct? As I walk the trails in this park, I'll relate the story of the search for oil and gas in Minnesota. As it turns out, if this park had an oil well, it wasn't the only one in Minnesota. The story begins in Fredonia, New York. In 1821, Fredonia was the site of the first commercial natural gas well in the United States. By 1859, the Drake Well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, was pumping out oil. An oil and gas fever quickly spread across the country. It wasn't long before natural gas and oil fields were discovered in West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and in other states. Minnesota was not immune to the oil and gas fever. In the mid-1870s, while prospecting for coal in Freeborn County, a crew dug an exploratory well. After drilling down about 50 feet, they heard a roaring sound coming from the wellhead. Mr. Rogers, the man who owned the land, stepped closer and, taking out his pipe, struck a match. Gas, escaping from the well, ignited, and the flame reached 8 to 10 feet above the wellhead. While they did not find coal, they did hit a pocket of gas. Accidental discoveries of gas or oil are not uncommon in Minnesota. Typically, a farmer or landowner, in the process of drilling a water well, hits a small pocket of gas or oil. These pockets are shallow, a couple of 100 feet at most beneath the surface. The gas or oil quickly escapes. Accidental discoveries have continued since then. In the 1980s, the St. Paul Dispatch reported that a water well being dug in Badness Heights hit a pocket of oil. It produced, according to the newspaper, enough oil to silence a squeaky hinge. So was the oil well here in Thomas Lake Park one of those accidental discoveries? No. The story on the 7 of diamonds is not describing an accidental discovery. Despite these accidental discoveries, by 1890, the state geologist, a man by the name of Newton Winchell, concluded that finding commercial quantities of oil or natural gas in Minnesota was unlikely. Minnesota does not contain the type of rocks that produce significant deposits of oil or natural gas. But not everyone agreed with his conclusion. The public was suspicious of what geologists knew about petroleum, primarily because of a blunder by the Ohio state geologist. He stated in a lecture in Findlay, Ohio, that natural gas would never be found there. But before he could leave town, natural gas was, of course, discovered. The Great Karg Well in Findlay, Ohio, was the largest gas well in the world at that time, producing 12 million cubic feet of gas a day. Because of one geologist's mistake, the public thought all geologists did not know where to find oil and natural gas. Geologists were academics, they reasoned, and did not have any experience in the petroleum fields. The self-appointed Petroleum experts believe that oil and natural gas could be found almost anywhere. You just had to drill deep enough to reach it. In Minnesota, the discovery of those small pockets of oil and gas near the surface surely must mean that large deposits lay deeper underground. This distrust of geologists ushered in the age of wildcatting. Wildcatting is drilling for oil or natural gas in an area that is not known for producing either oil or natural gas. Freeborn, site of that accidental discovery, was one of the first sites for a wildcat well in Minnesota. Unfortunately for the Freeborn wildcatters, they did not find any oil or natural gas. Later, a so-called petroleum expert from the oil fields of Pennsylvania insisted that the area around Minneapolis and St. Paul held deposits of natural gas. A group of local businessmen formed a company and began drilling in Falcon Heights on the Minnesota State Fairgrounds, in North St. Paul, in South St. Paul, and in Faribault. About the South St. Paul well, Newton Winchell would write that it would go to posterity without any record, except as a monument to men ignorant of geology, but eager for wealth. Deep wildcat wells were being drilled all across the state: Mankato, Duluth, Stillwater, Moorhead, and at Rochester. In the 1920s, a Missouri mining engineer came to Rochester for surgery at the Mayo Clinic. While recovering, he drove around the countryside and noted that the lay of the land was like the oil fields he had seen out west. The Minnesota State geologist W. H. Emmons explained that there was little chance he would find oil or natural gas. But that didn't stop him. With the help of an out-of-state geologist, he selected a site east of Rochester. When the well reached a depth of 3,265 feet, they abandoned the project. At the time, it was the deepest man-made hole in Minnesota. Despite the lack of any success, oil and gas fever still ran unabated across Minnesota. But at Lake Lillian in Kandiyohi County, the fever had a slightly different twist. A man by the name of Axel Lundquist claimed to have hauled gasoline out of a well in the cellar of his restaurant. He said he was getting 13 gallons of gasoline a day from the well. The gasoline was so pure, he said, that he was running his automobile on it. Geologists at the University of Minnesota said that if there's anything in that well that will run a gasoline engine, it's been put there by a human being. Nevertheless, oil drilling began at Lake Lillian. For many years, people believed a lake of oil underlay that part of the state. The drilling continued at Baudette, Granite Falls, Blue Earth, Madison, Thief River Falls, Florian, Cokato, 5 more wells in Kandiyohi County, still looking for that lake of oil, Wall Township in Traverse County, in the Keister Hills of Faribault County, and at Hastings. The discovery of oil in the Williston Basin of North Dakota in 1951 reignited oil and gas fever in western Minnesota. In 1952, a syndicate obtained the drilling rights to 21,000 acres in Kandiyohi and Renville counties. One member of the syndicate claimed he had a sixth sense for finding oil. He selected the site for the first well and stated that, a year from now, it is reasonable to expect there will be 150 wells in operation. The Minnesota Geologic Survey responded that there is no possibility of gas or oil in Kandiyohi County. Although they started drilling, the Minnesota Securities Commission shut down the operation for violating the state's blue sky laws. Blue sky laws are regulations designed to protect the public from fraud and speculative investments like oil wells in Minnesota. The chairman of the geology department at the University of Minnesota tried to squash the rumors of oil in Minnesota, but he immediately ran into opposition. Some people still believed that Minnesota held more oil than states to the south. Others thought there was a conspiracy between the geologists and the major oil companies that was preventing Minnesota's oil from being exploited. That brings us back to this park. So what's the story with the oil well that the Seven-A-Diamond says was here? I think its story begins in 1928 in Dassel, Minnesota, when a farmer noticed an oily substance coming out of his shallow water well. Minneapolis and Dassel businessmen formed a company to finance a test well. They hired a consultant, Peter Lund, a Minneapolis geologist. Contrary to other Minnesota geologists, Peter Lund believed that there is evidence to indicate strong possibilities of oil being found in Dassel in commercial quantities. The Minnesota Securities Commission knew the only oil in Minnesota was in filling stations and tank cars. They made anyone who wanted to invest in the Dassel oil well read a warning. The warning stated, geologically speaking, petroleum in commercial quantities is presumed not to exist in Minnesota. Peter Lund, however, responded, there is only one way to find out definitely, and that is to dig. So once again, the drilling began. When the oil well in Dassel came up dry, Peter Lund turned his attention to this area here in Dakota County. He was now promoting the idea that under Minnesota were several geologic domes which he believed could accumulate oil. The most valuable of these domes was the one right here, the Mendota Dome. This oil structure, as Mr. Lund called it, was a 14-mile by 16-mile rectangle that included this park. Peter Lund recruited another businessman, Edwin Gunberg, a Minneapolis investment broker, to help him exploit this oil field. Mr. Gunberg said he had samples of the surface dirt tested, which showed the soil and water to be saturated with petroleum. Together, Lund and Gunberg acquired the rights to drill for oil on 19,000 acres of land here in Dakota County. In 1935, Lund and Gunberg were ready to drill. The first well was situated near the center of the oil structure, near the Rosemont and Apple Valley border, a little less than 2 miles from where I'm walking now. Locals estimated that up to 1,000 people stopped by the well to watch the drilling. The promoters resold their land leases to the spectators. Most of the investors were from Minneapolis. Like in Dassel, the Minnesota Security Commission had investors sign a statement saying that they understood the venture was highly speculative and that they were content to proceed at their own risk. The local farmers were suspicious of the operation. None were investors. Some knew that it was a fake. Years later, they would recollect how one of the workers of the drilling company poured tractor case oil down the well so that, when it was pumped out, it gave the groundwater a rainbow sheen. Lund and Gunberg were not the only promoters operating in this area. A group of St. Paul businessmen formed another venture, and a Louisiana group formed a third. I believe there were about 7 drilling sites in the Rosemont area. Some were nothing more than a pipe pounded into the ground. By 1937, after finding no oil in any of the wells, drilling quietly stopped. But the controversy over these wells was just beginning. Many of the residents of the Rosemont area believed the promoters had been out to scam people. In Hennepin County, a grand jury began investigating the sale, in Minneapolis, of unregistered oil, royalty, and land leases related to the Rosemont wells. 2 men were set to go on trial for selling unregistered securities. The trial, however, was canceled when the men refunded the purchase price to the investor. The Minnesota State Commissioner of Securities in 1939 warned the citizens of Minnesota not to repeat what he termed the Rosemont fiasco of 1936 and 1937. He claimed Minnesotans lost $37,000 in the Rosemont oil well scheme and said, "Promoters who periodically revive the oil racket here are either blindly enthusiastic or definitely out to take advantage of the uninformed and unwary." Of the 2 chief promoters of the Rosemont wells, Peter Lund was last seen in Minnesota in 1937. The Minneapolis City Directory for 1938 no longer listed Peter Lund. In the 1940 census, he was living in San Antonio, Texas. Edwin Gunberg remained in Minnesota, but died in 1944. The Rosemont oil wells were quickly forgotten, but 50 years later, the farmland began sprouting housing developments. A construction crew hit something unexpected, one of the old oil wells. The county, for the next decade or so, had to find all these old oil wells again. They wanted to make sure the wells were properly capped to protect the groundwater from any contamination. The last of the Rosemont wells was finally sealed in 2003. The Minnesota Geological Survey estimates that over 1,000 wildcat oil and gas wells were drilled in Minnesota. All were dry. Was one of those wildcat wells in this park, as a story on the Seven of Diamonds describes? Perhaps. The Minnesota Geological Survey does not have a record of an oil well in this park, but its records are not complete, especially for oil wells sunk before 1970. I have no doubt that the events described on the card did happen. Whether they happened here in this park or a short distance from here in Rosemont, I can't say for sure. And if you're ever tempted to invest in an oil well in Minnesota, Matt Walton of the Minnesota Geological Survey has some advice for you. Take your money to Las Vegas. Your chances of coming home a winner are a lot better. That brings us to the end of my walk in Thomas Lake Park and my look back at the hunt for oil in Minnesota. If you want to learn more, check the description of this video for some resources. Walking the trails is good for the aging body, and continuing to learn is good for the aging brain. I hope this video inspires you to visit your local parks and trails and to learn about the events that happen there. You never know what you might find.